I think the distinctive features of my commentary, and all the commentaries have distinctive features, so it's not that mine is better than the others, it's just I've chosen to emphasize different things. I think some of the things I would emphasize, which I've mentioned before, is the interaction with some of the archaeological discoveries. I try and do more with situating the letter in its context in Phrygia, the region of modern Turkey where Colossae was located. I also compare some of the cultic practices that I think are in the background with what we know from places like Aphrodisias, which is a much better preserved site. There's a longer discussion than most commentaries on the text of Colossians, the range of textual witnesses, the manuscripts that preserve the text. It's not till the 4th century that we actually have a complete text of Colossians in Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. The myth used to be how much better off we are than Westcott and Hort. They only had a 4th century text. We now have a 2nd century. Well, actually for Colossians, the whole text doesn't emerge till the 4th. We do have Papyrus 46, P46, which preserves 81 of the 95 verses, or at least parts of 81 of the 95 verses. So just wanted to map that textual landscape out. And I think also I try and present the theology in a more linked up way or a more coherent way by looking at its views on things like Christology especially, but also its view on God, which we've often spoken about as being something that's been neglected in New Testament studies, but the ecclesiology, the eschatology, and so on. So I think talking about the theology of the letter in a more structured and coherent way, I hope, is one of the contributions it's made. Authorship is a contested issue in relation to Colossians, but what I try to map out is there are more possibilities than Paul was the author or Paul wasn't the author. Even within those two broad ideas, there are a range of possibilities. It definitely doesn't look like Paul physically wrote all of Colossians. He takes up the pen at the end. If it is Paul, the assumed author takes up the pen and writes him a personal greeting. So you've at least got Paul dictating a letter to someone else. Now, I think often when Paul does that in the genuine letters, it seems quite likely that he is in control of the content, being quite precise. Now, in Colossians, the assumed situation is that Paul is in chains, as he says a couple of times. So how did that restrain him? How much interaction did Timothy, his co-worker, have with him? If it was Timothy who was the co-author of the letter, was it Timothy coming along and Paul dictating, or was Paul giving Timothy the major themes? So another possibility was Timothy had more freedom, but was discussing with Paul what was going on. I mean, slightly more removed from that is greater freedom given to whoever writes the letter during Paul's lifetime. And that could be, these are the issues in Colossae. You know how I write these letters. You know I'm in chains. Please go and write one for me and check with me anything. So you've got that range of possible authorship in Paul's lifetime. And I don't know if people would be happy to call all those options Pauline authorship or not. That's not really my concern. But you could almost see that Paul could give that same message to someone, go and write a letter in my name, die that night, and the person might not be able to come back and check the contents with him. Does that stop being Pauline commissioning or authorship? And where do we draw the line? So I've tried to problematize this, and of course then the next phase might be a co-worker, not so much commissioned to write in Paul's name, but closely associated with Paul, knows what the aims of the Pauline mission were, sees problems in Colossae, and decides to write a letter independently. Other options have been that the letter is more of a circular letter written to the three churches in the area, Colossae, Laodicea, Hierapolis, and again, the contents aren't quite so specific to Colossae. And then a sixth option that people have suggested is it's more a universal letter, perhaps in the way the letter to the Ephesians is, maybe to the Ephesians was even put in later, and Colossians again has a similarly universal scope. When I started writing the commentary, I wasn't sure what I would argue. I thought I might argue more for Pauline authorship. I'd written an article defending the Pauline authorship of 2 Thessalonians. It was more as I wrote the letter and looked at some of the theological issues that I began to think more and more. This felt more distant from what Paul usually did. Now, I came up with a few things that I thought were not characteristically Pauline, and I must admit, one by one, all of these things could be answered. You could say, yes, but in this case, Paul might do this instead. It was more the cumulative weight of those things. So I think the main areas were, in terms of the ecclesiology, I think the ecclesiology is more universal in Colossians, but not totally unevidenced in some of the genuine epistles. The eschatology is definitely more realized, but there are some future elements there as well, so there's a balance. Other things I noted were there are very few references to the Holy Spirit, perhaps only one, which would make it, doing a bit of boring maths, the lowest ratio of references to the Spirit of any of the Pauline letters, apart from Philemon. And then also there's no real explicit citation of the Old Testament. There might be one or two allusions to it, but again, very low use of the Old Testament. Same happens in Philippians, which most people feel is genuine, but it's all those factors together that led me to question whether Paul was the author. I also felt that the letter addresses some concrete circumstances. It isn't quite as generalized as Ephesians. There seemed to be a real problem going on. So I felt that could be located more securely in Colossae. So I think in the end I went for the fourth of my scenarios, that not written by Paul, written by someone closely associated with him, but written to a real location, Colossae, and addressing concrete problems there.